In 1991, the American political landscape was rocked by a Supreme Court nomination that would become one of the most contentious in history. As the Senate Judiciary Committee prepared to consider the nominee, the proceedings initially followed the expected course. Testimonies, legal analysis, and partisan questions dominated the airwaves. Yet, everything changed when a former colleague of the nominee came forward with deeply troubling allegations. The woman, a law professor with a poised demeanor and measured tone, testified before the Senate, accusing the nominee of sexual harassment during their time working together at 2 federal agencies. The accusations were specific, disturbing, and entirely unexpected. She described a pattern of inappropriate behavior that included lewd comments, unsolicited discussions of pornography, and other sexually explicit conduct. Her allegations challenged the very foundation of the nominee's character and professional integrity. The nation watched in rapt attention as the committee was forced to reconvene for a second round of hearings, this time entirely focused on her testimony. Overnight, a process that had once seemed routine was transformed into a national spectacle. What unfolded was more than a vetting of a Supreme Court candidate. It became a referendum on how the country confronted sexual harassment, especially in powerful institutions. Senators from both parties found themselves under intense scrutiny, not only for the questions they asked, but for their tone, their assumptions, and the degree to which they appeared to believe or dismiss the accuser. While some attempted to support her and probe the allegations with seriousness, others grilled her aggressively, insinuating ulterior motives or questioning her memory and credibility. These confrontations were broadcast live, sparking heated debates in living rooms, workplaces, and college campuses across America. The woman's testimony marked the first time many Americans had heard the term sexual harassment discussed so openly on national television. The explicit nature of the details made the hearings uncomfortable for some viewers, but they were also revelatory. For countless women who had experienced similar treatment in silence, this moment offered visibility and validation. It gave a name to behaviors they had endured but never publicly challenged. The public reaction was swift and intense. Phone lines to Senate offices were flooded with calls. Protesters gathered in Washington, and editorial pages filled with impassioned commentary. The issue had broken through to the mainstream. Meanwhile, the nominee sat through the hearings in silence, awaiting a chance to respond. He would ultimately deny all allegations, and the committee would remain deeply divided. But regardless of the final outcome, the hearings had already altered the public conversation. What began as a routine confirmation had become a mirror held up to American society, reflecting the complexities of power, gender, race, and justice. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Women across the country began to speak out about their own experiences with harassment in the workplace. Calls to legal hotlines surged. Companies began reevaluating their policies, and lawmakers introduced new legislation. The events of that autumn ignited a movement, laying the groundwork for cultural shifts that would unfold in the decades to come. The televised hearings served as a collective awakening, pushing a private issue into public consciousness and demanding a reckoning from institutions long reluctant to change. The woman who testified bore the brunt of that storm. She faced criticism, threats, and relentless media scrutiny. Yet she also became a symbol of courage to many, an individual who dared to speak truth to power on the most prominent stage imaginable. Her decision to come forward was not without personal cost, but it marked a turning point in how such claims were perceived and handled, both in government and beyond. Her testimony and the reaction to it would resonate far beyond the walls of the Senate chamber, becoming one of the most influential moments in modern political history. The tension in the room was electric. Every eye was fixed on the witness chair as the nominee finally addressed the Senate Judiciary Committee. He had sat through days of accusations, his reputation hanging in the balance, and now it was his moment to respond. When he spoke, he didn't hold back. He launched into a blistering rebuttal of the proceedings, framing the entire ordeal not as a legitimate inquiry, but as a deeply unjust spectacle. His words came not with the measured cadence of a careful defense, but with the fury of someone who believed he had been wronged on a profound level. He did not merely deny the accusations. He attacked the process itself. He painted the hearings as a calculated effort to destroy his character and career. The calm, composed image he had maintained throughout the initial stages of the confirmation process was now replaced by open indignation. He called the entire episode a circus and a national disgrace. But it was the phrase that came next that would burn itself into the historical record. He referred to the proceedings as a high-tech lynching. The phrase was a deliberate invocation of racial history, painful, graphic, and intended to shock. With that choice of words, he reframed the narrative. What had been cast as an investigation into allegations of misconduct was now being portrayed as a brutal, modern version of racial persecution. He positioned himself not just as an individual under scrutiny, but as a symbol of a broader historical injustice. In his view, powerful interests were conspiring to punish him not for anything he had done, but for daring to rise to a position of influence and independence as a black man who did not conform to certain political or ideological expectations. This rhetorical pivot was a masterstroke. It forced the public and many members of the committee to reassess what they were witnessing. Was this truly a search for truth? Or was it something more insidious? An attempt to publicly dismantle someone who challenged conventional narratives? The introduction of racial themes into the hearings complicated everything. Suddenly, questions that had been about conduct and character became entangled with America's long, painful legacy of race injustice. Allies and critics alike were forced to consider the optics and implications of continuing the line of inquiry. Many in the room were visibly rattled. Senators who had been pressing the nominee with tough questions were now seen through a different lens. Were they doing their duty, or were they, knowingly or not, participants in a ritual humiliation rooted in something much deeper and uglier? The nominee's words also resonated beyond the chamber. In African American communities, in academic circles, in media roundtables, his framing of the ordeal as a racial persecution struck a chord. It opened a new dimension to the national conversation, one that had not been fully addressed in the coverage of the allegations. His approach wasn't without risk. By going on the offensive, by accusing the process itself of being illegitimate, he risked alienating those who might have been persuaded by a more conventional defense. But that wasn't the strategy. The goal was not merely to clear his name. It was to change the terms of the debate. He refused to play the role of the accused in the way the public expected. Instead, he became the accuser, challenging the fairness, the motives, and even the morality of the system he stood before. The response was polarized. Some saw him as a victim of character assassination, a man who had been dragged through the mud for political reasons. Others viewed his anger as an attempt to deflect from the serious charges he faced, yet even those who doubted his innocence had to admit the effectiveness of his performance. His emotional intensity, his clarity of purpose, and his invocation of historical pain made it nearly impossible to ignore his perspective. The hearings, already chaotic, now bordered on the surreal. What had started as a legal and ethical examination had morphed into a cultural and political battle unlike anything Washington had seen. In that charged moment, the nominee not only fought for his appointment, but reshaped how public figures might defend themselves under fire. He demonstrated that the courtroom of public opinion could be influenced as much by passion and narrative as by facts and evidence. His strategy became a case study in political survival, an example of how, when cornered, turning the spotlight back on the accusers can be a powerful and polarizing move. The memory of that defiant testimony would linger for years, a defining example of how identity, emotion, and power intersect in the most consequential. The televised hearings captivated the nation, but their influence stretched far beyond the walls of the Senate chamber. What began as a contentious confirmation process evolved into a cultural flashpoint that reshaped public discourse around workplace ethics, gender dynamics, and the power structures embedded within them. The stark, explicit nature of the testimony delivered during those proceedings forced millions of viewers to confront uncomfortable truths that had long simmered beneath the surface of American life. At the heart of the controversy was a law professor who bravely came forward to recount her experiences of workplace harassment. Her testimony was calm, deliberate, and resolute. She detailed interactions that were deeply inappropriate, laced with sexual innuendo, and entirely unsolicited. While the legal merits of her claims became the subject of intense debate, the social impact was undeniable. For many Americans, particularly women, her words echoed personal experiences that had never been given space or validation in public forums. In speaking out, she illuminated a silent epidemic. What followed was a national reckoning. Across the country, conversations erupted in offices, classrooms, and homes. Water cooler talk turned into serious discussions about what constituted harassment, how it manifested, and why so many people, particularly women, had felt powerless to address it. The concept of sexual harassment had existed in legal terms, but now it had a face, a voice, and a story that resonated with millions. People began to understand that these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader cultural pattern that had gone unchecked for decades. The media, which had initially treated the hearings as a political drama, soon shifted focus to the social implications. News outlets ran stories featuring individuals who shared their own experiences of being harassed at work. The anonymity that once cloaked such discussions gave way to a groundswell of personal testimonies. Hotlines received record numbers of calls. Workplace training sessions were restructured or newly implemented. Human resources departments were inundated with inquiries from employees seeking clarity about their rights. The hearings had not just introduced a subject, they had ignited a movement. Legislators, too, took notice. Members of Congress who had previously remained silent on the issue began introducing bills aimed at strengthening protections for workers and holding employers accountable for failing to act. Legal scholars began reevaluating existing frameworks to better define and address harassment. In law schools and policy forums, new models of accountability were proposed, driven by the recognition that current mechanisms often favored silence over justice. The idea that harassment was a private matter began to erode, replaced by a growing consensus that it was a systemic issue requiring public attention and structural reform. The most immediate and visible effect, however, was on public awareness. For perhaps the first time, everyday people were engaging in earnest discussions about power dynamics in professional environments. It became clear that harassment was not only about inappropriate behavior, but also about control, who wielded it, how it was enforced, and what it cost to challenge it. This understanding marked a significant shift in how people viewed workplace relationships. The idea that harassment could derail careers, silence voices, and inflict lasting emotional harm gained traction in the national consciousness. This cultural awakening did not occur in a vacuum. It was amplified by the visual nature of the hearings. Seeing a composed, articulate woman describe her experiences in front of an all-male panel highlighted the imbalance in representation and authority. Viewers noted not only what was said, but how it was received. The interruptions, the skepticism, the patronizing tones. These dynamics underscored the difficulty of coming forward and the courage required to persist in the face of institutional doubt. In that sense, the hearings functioned as both a lesson and a warning. Speaking truth to power was possible, but not without consequence. In the months that followed, the impact continued to build. Surveys showed a significant uptick in the number of women reporting harassment. Advocacy organizations gained new supporters and funding. Educational institutions revised curricula to include discussions about consent and professional ethics. Employers re-examined their internal policies, some for the first time. The national dialogue had been transformed, and while change was uneven and ongoing, the direction was clear. The hearings had torn the veil off a widespread issue and made it part of mainstream conversation. No longer confined to whispered complaints or internal memos, the topic of harassment had entered the public square with undeniable force. It became a benchmark, a reference point in the long, complex journey toward workplace equality and respect. After weeks of heated debate, intense scrutiny, and emotionally charged testimony, the final vote arrived. It was close, razor thin, reflecting just how divided the nation had become over the nomination. But when the tally was announced, the outcome was unmistakable. Confirmation. Despite the controversy, despite the allegations, and despite the public protests, The nominee had secured a seat on the highest court in the land. It was a moment that symbolized both the durability of political power and the limitations of public outcry, leaving observers grappling with what the decision truly meant for the country. In the immediate aftermath, reactions fell along sharply drawn lines. Supporters hailed the confirmation as a victory for due process and the principle that unproven allegations should not derail a career. To them, the outcome reaffirmed the belief that individuals must be judged by evidence, not emotion, and that political maneuvering should not be allowed to dictate judicial appointments. They viewed the narrow vote as a vindication, a triumph of resilience over character assassination, of personal integrity against a storm of unsubstantiated claims. Opponents, however, saw something very different. To them, the confirmation was a chilling sign that institutional power still outweighed accountability. They believed the decision sent a dangerous message, that credible allegations of misconduct could be minimized or dismissed entirely if the political stakes were high enough. It was a moment of disillusionment for many, particularly women, who had hoped the high-profile hearings might mark a turning point in how the country handled issues of sexual harassment and abuse of power. Instead, the vote confirmed their worst: fears about the resilience of entrenched systems and the slow pace of meaningful change. But regardless of which side one took, there was no denying the historical weight of the appointment. The new justice now held a lifetime position, one that would allow him to influence American law and society for decades. From the bench, he would help shape landmark rulings on issues ranging from reproductive rights and affirmative action to gun control and executive authority. His presence on the court altered the ideological balance, reinforcing a conservative tilt that would come to define many of the court's most consequential decisions in the years ahead. Yet the legacy of UFO, the confirmation, was not limited to judicial outcomes. It had a cultural and political resonance that extended far beyond the marble halls of the Supreme Court. The public scrutiny surrounding the hearings had laid bare the inner workings of power in Washington. It exposed the extent to which personal, narratives and political calculations intertwined in the nation's most important institutions. The televised drama gave Americans a front-row seat to the raw, often unfiltered emotions behind governance, and it left a lasting impression on how people viewed the judicial nomination process. In the political realm, the vote galvanized a new generation of activists. The discontent that had built during the hearings did not fade with the final tally. Instead, it erupted into a surge of civic engagement. In the following year, record numbers of women ran for public office. Voter turnout increased. Lawmakers, who had seemed indifferent or dismissive during the proceedings, were voted out or challenged by candidates promising change. The hearings had ignited a fire, and the energy they produced did not dissipate. It redirected into action. In academic and legal circles, the appointment sparked renewed interest in the concept of judicial ethics. Scholars began to examine how allegations of misconduct should be weighed against qualifications. Debates erupted over the limits of public accountability and the role of moral character in assessing someone for a lifetime position. Law schools began integrating discussions of the confirmation process into their curricula, recognizing that the case had become a crucial reference point for understanding the intersection of law, politics, and society. Even in popular culture, the hearings left a deep imprint. Documentaries, books, plays, and films explored the events in detail, each offering different perspectives on the motivations, consequences, and emotional toll involved. The story became a touchstone, revisited each time new allegations surfaced in other high-profile arenas. It served as a kind of cultural memory, an unresolved chapter that continued to inform contemporary debates about fairness, justice, and the cost of silence. While the new justice took his seat quietly and began his work on the bench, the echo of the confirmation battle persisted in the national dialogue. The appointment may have concluded the hearings, but it opened a new era in public awareness and civic activism. What had once been seen as a procedural step in the machinery of government had become a transformative event, one whose reverberations could still be felt long after the gavel struck. The confirmation hearings and the events surrounding them marked a pivotal moment in American history, one that transcended the appointment of a single individual to the Supreme Court. They exposed deeply rooted tensions within the nation's political, cultural, and social fabric. What was originally a procedural matter became a national spectacle, opening a window into how power is protected, how accusations are weighed, and how justice is perceived in the public eye. More than a political trial, the hearings became a mirror held up to the country, reflecting uncomfortable truths about gender, race, credibility, and institutional trust. One of the most enduring legacies of the moment was the national awakening around workplace harassment. For years, countless individuals, particularly women, had suffered in silence, unsure of whether their voices would be heard or their experiences validated. The testimony given during those hearings gave language to their pain, and in doing so, broke open a dialogue that had long been suppressed. People began to recognize that harassment wasn't confined to dark corners or private spaces. It thrived in boardrooms, classrooms, government offices, and courtrooms. The courage of one voice sparked a collective outcry that could no longer be ignored. At the same time, the proceedings forced Americans to confront the reality that institutional power often shields those at the top. Despite the severity of the allegations, and despite the public outrage they inspired, the nominee was confirmed. That outcome underscored how politics, rather than ethics, often dictates the outcomes of such battles. For many, it was a disheartening realization. Yet paradoxically, it also galvanized a new era of activism. Citizens, especially women and marginalized groups, were moved to action. They organized, they ran for office, they voted, and they demanded better. The hearings may have exposed the flaws of the system, but they also ignited the will to reform it. In the years since, the echoes of that moment have been heard in movements across industries and generations. From the rise of Me Too to a re-examination of how leaders are held accountable, the cultural shift sparked by those hearings continues to evolve. They demonstrated that a single event, however painful or controversial, can become a catalyst for lasting change when people refuse to forget or remain silent. While the immediate outcome disappointed many, the long-term impact empowered countless others to step forward, tell their stories, and expect justice. Ultimately, the legacy of that time cannot be measured solely by the vote count or the decisions rendered from the bench in the years that followed. Its true significance lies in how it reshaped public consciousness, how it redefined the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and how it inspired a new generation to question, to speak, and to lead. What began as a confirmation battle became something far more enduring, a national turning point that challenged complacency and sparked a movement toward greater accountability, empathy,